Live from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Mathieu, I'm Kailey Leinz, and it is the final day of the RNC. We are awaiting night 4 and the acceptance speech of former President Donald Trump. The first time we will hear him speak as the official nominee of the Republican Party, and of course the first time he will be addressing the nation on camera, at least, since surviving an assassination attempt last weekend.
Pretty remarkable, because we've seen him every day of this convention, which is somewhat unusual in the traditional world of politics, but nothing is traditional with Donald Trump. He's been in the hall getting a round of applause, and we've even seen scores of people wearing bandages on their ears in solidarity with the former president, Kailey. But you were in the room last night for J.D. Vance. His big night out. Very well received in the room.
Oh, absolutely. The energy was pretty incredible. There were chants and cheers quite often in his speech that really focused a lot on who J.D. Vance is, at least in terms of what he thinks about policy, populism, the working man. Key themes in his remarks last night as he officially accepted the nomination as Trump's vice presidential candidate. Joining us now with more, Bloomberg's Lara Davison and Stephanie Lai, who are with us now. So it's interesting to consider here that we heard J.D. Vance last night, not necessarily being an attack dog, but clearly speaking to a very specific group of voters. He's calling out the working man in specific states, which he said by name multiple times: Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Is J.D. Vance on this ticket to expand the base, or just speak directly to that and leave the expansion to others, Laura?
Well, because of the Electoral College, Trump doesn't necessarily need to expand the base if he can win in these blue wall states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And that is where Vance, he spent all of his time talking to those people. The Biden team has signaled for months that their path to success is through those states. Trump has already, been polling very well in some of those southern states, Arizona, Georgia. So if he is able to win just one or two of those, it's game over for Biden. Of course, it's also important to remember the backdrop of what's happening here, in that we started the week with it looking like Biden would stay in the race after the assassination attempt against Trump on Saturday. The winds have totally shifted on that front. So this is a very live ball on sort of what Vance could bring to the ticket and what the campaign looks like even in 2 days from now.
Well, let's bring our viewers and listeners into the room. J.D. Vance from last night.
Wall Street barons crashed the economy and American builders went out of business. As tradesmen scrambled for jobs, houses stopped being built. The lack of good jobs, of course, led to stagnant wages. We're done, ladies and gentlemen, catering to Wall Street. We'll commit to the working man.
So there you have it, Stephanie. The Republican Party is the populist economic party now. This is the platform.
This is something that we've been hearing from folks for the last year. And in fact, this really does feel like a key realignment in the Republican Party. A lot of the messaging that they've put out, and something that Vance does particularly well at, is mentioning that, the Republican Party can be a very diverse party. It doesn't matter what race you are, what economic class you are. As long as you believe in their American first agenda, they will welcome you.
It's really something, though. Kailey, you were there last night to hear Donald Trump Jr. talk about the fact that he was friends, this kid from Trump Tower, this kid from Appalachia. How do you strike themes of economic populism when you're a billionaire?
Well, but that's what they've been trying to do with Trump all along, right? Saying that, yes, this big real estate developer from New York was able to tap into something within the American people that Joe Biden or previous Democrats were not able to do. And it also makes me question what tone we're likely to hear from Donald Trump himself tonight. Of course, we've heard in the aftermath of what happened in Pennsylvania last weekend, he ripped up what was supposed to be, in his words, a humdinger of a speech. He wants to focus more on unity. But if he speaks for an hour and a half tonight, Stephanie, are we going to be able to stay on that unity message for the duration?
It's always very hard to tell with Donald Trump. He has prepared remarks on his teleprompter, and oftentimes, we'll get a copy in advance to see what he'll say. And more often than not, he'll sway from time to time. But given the fact that this is going to be live casted by many news stations, there is a good chance that he'll just stick to the script. But, we never know.
We never know. But this is the night that he has been looking forward to, I guess you could say, since January 6th. The mindset that Donald Trump is going to bring to the podium tonight is a real question after what happened last weekend. Is he a changed man? We keep hearing references to divine intervention in the room. Is that what we'll hear?
It's almost certainly. He's been mentioning God a lot more. There's been, lots of references from people talking about, that God saved him. Just think about a couple months ago, Nikki Haley was talking about how, this primary is akin to more of a coronation. Now it might seem that it's almost, sort of a divine intervention or, sort of some crowning and ascendancy of the gods. This is, going to be really the high point for Trump. He has worked up to this. His previous two conventions were racked by either the pandemic or by internal party squabbles. He now has everyone rowing with him and has even appointed his next heir that is really a person who came into politics in the mold of Donald Trump.
Well, and J.D. Vance also made a point yesterday to point out that he has been alive for fewer years than Joe Biden has been in Washington. J.D. Vance very much went after Biden at multiple times during the speech. And I wonder to what extent Trump will as well, given the developments around the Biden candidacy, Laura, we have seen in just the last 24 hours. First, Adam Schiff, the congressman from California, calling him to drop out. Then a COVID-19 positive test that has sidelined him. Now he's isolating in Delaware. Then reports from outlets, including ABC, that Chuck Schumer has essentially told him that he needs to leave the race. Hakeem Jeffries, according to the Washington Post, told him that he's imperiling Democrats' hopes of holding on to either chamber of commerce. And CNN reporting Nancy Pelosi has told him polling suggests that he can't win. So is Trump about to deliver his big speech? If he's peaking now, is this the crater for Joe Biden's reelection campaign?
It's not looking great. I mean, if Donald Trump is having, the luckiest week of his life, he survives his assassination attempt, his legal troubles all but go away, he's, giving his big speech, this has got to be Joe Biden's unluckiest week of his life, where everything around him seems to be crumbling. And now it's not as much of a question of will he step down, but, what are the next steps that need to happen and when will this announcement come?
If somebody wrote the book, nobody would believe it. It would be, unrealistic fiction, but here we are living this. This means also Joe Biden's off the trail for days and days, canceling interviews. What do they do with this time that he has to think?
Well, I think for Democrats, it's really about getting the party back together and figuring out what message do they send to voters, because a lot of this right now doesn't necessarily look good on the party. And so they can spend this time really focusing on, recalibrating what their message will be. Now that they have J.D. Vance on this ticket, they can also start attacking, whatever stances that he's had in the past to try to sway voters. He's quite a firebrand politician, and so they can pull from a lot of his previous statements and try to make the case.
Yeah, sure. Really great to have both of you with us. Good luck on your reporting this last day of the convention. Laura Davison and Stephanie Lai with us on Balance of Power here on Bloomberg. Let's get inside the hall right now. Bloomberg's own Tyler Kendall joins us on this day 4 of the Republican National Convention from Milwaukee. How's it look, Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Joe. Well, as you've been talking about, when former President Trump takes the stage tonight, he will officially accept the Republican nomination. And if we look at some of the speeches over the past few days, it might give us some clues to what he's going to focus on. And you've mentioned Senator J.D. Vance in his speech last night. He really used it to reach out to voters in some key battleground states. That includes Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, all states that President Biden won in 2020. And I want you to listen to this one bite where he is naming these states specifically and how he tailored his message not just to voters, but to some specific workers and industries.
It's about all of us, and it's about who we're fighting for. It's about the auto worker in Michigan wondering why out-of-touch politicians are destroying their jobs. It's about the factory worker in Wisconsin who makes things with their hands and is proud of American craftsmanship.
Now, notably, a new Emerson College poll out today shows former President Trump leading President Biden in 7 key battleground states. Those include the 3 that I mentioned before. So it's going to be interesting to see how the Trump campaign really looks to impact and reach these voters in these blue state walls. Now, of course, we also have learned that former President Trump did rewrite his speech after that attempted assassination over the weekend. He said that he rewrote it to include a more message focused on unity. So we're going to have to see how that all plays out. Of course, Joe and Kailey will be watching to see how he targets President Biden as all this new reporting comes out that more senior level Democrats within the party are urging him to step down, and how he threads that needle between his criticism of President Biden, but also Vice President Kamala Harris.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, thank you so much. And as Tyler mentions the building pressure on President Biden, I would just point out the headline just crossing the Bloomberg terminal from the Washington Post. that says Obama, the former President Barack Obama, is telling allies that Biden needs to reconsider his campaign. The pressure is continuing to grow on the Democrats, Joe, as the Republicans seem quite unified here in Milwaukee.
The walls are closing in, or I guess the other cliche we would reach for is the image on Bloomberg Daybreak this morning of Joe Biden sitting in a chair painted into a corner. These couple of days where he's going to be recovering from COVID will be key. This is a remarkable moment that we come together here in American politics.
It has just been an incredible sequence of events the last 4 days, as this is day 4 of the RNC and the convention here preparing for Donald Trump's speech tonight. Again, the first time we will hear him addressing the nation since that attempted assassination in Pennsylvania last weekend. Joining us now for more on all of this is Senator James Lankford, who is here with us in Milwaukee. So, Senator, as we think about the fact that this RNC is happening against a backdrop of what was a terrifying and tragic event for the country last weekend, and it has raised a lot of questions about what exactly happened last weekend and what needs to happen going forward. And you were among a group of your colleagues last night that spoke directly to the director of the Secret Service, Kimberly Cheadle. As we've seen, it got a bit contentious as things move forward. You yourself weren't necessarily engaging in the behavior of others like Senator Marsha Blackburn. But did you learn anything from her? Are you getting answers to the questions you have?
So I think the frustration the four of us had, it was Marsha Blackburn, John Barrasso, Kevin Kramer, and myself that had a moment to be able to visit with her in her suite to say, we just had a phone call with you 4 hours before. We were given 5 questions among 100 senators. There are a lot of unanswered questions, and our issue was we need answers to questions. I serve on the Homeland Security Committee. We're looking for time with her directly, with some of her leadership, and the questions are getting larger rather than smaller. And the initial questions were, why was that roof covered? Why is there a roof clearly within the line of sight that no one was covering? The second big question that's coming up now is, 15 minutes before President Trump actually took to the stage, there was already a conversation between local law enforcement and Secret Service that there's a suspicious person with a rangefinder that they are identifying, that they're trying to be able to find, that people had pointed out. There was already this sense and this flurry around that location to say there's someone here that looks dangerous. And Secret Service let him go on stage anyway. They didn't say pause for 10 minutes until we can find this guy. They just let everything move forward while they were still searching for someone they saw as a threat. That's a very obvious question to say, why didn't they just pause everything until they found a person that they'd already called as suspicious?
You're painting a picture of multiple failures here. Like they say, it takes, 9 things to go wrong for an airplane to crash. It sounds like we had a lot of them, and there could be more coming. I don't know if you want her to step down, if you've made that clear now. But if she doesn't quit, to what extent can Congress, what extent can the Senate move her out of that job?
Well, the House will have hearings. She's already agreed to that. Yep. Homeland Security is pushing to obviously have hearings as well. This is a good thing to be able to do to get this information out. It does twofold. One, gets the facts out to the American people. One, it also pushes down the conspiracy theories out there that are not factual.
Right. Both
those things need to get out, but people need to be held to account. The question is, there was leadership on site at that location that could have made a call to be able to protect the president, and this gentleman that was murdered and others that were injured, that all could have been prevented. So the question is, who did not make the call? What accountability is there? The 3 levels that they have was Secret Service one level, federal law enforcement the next, local law enforcement at the next level. There was communication there that was coming back to Secret Service, and Secret Service wasn't communicating back in a level. We need to know more about that. And yes, I do think the director is going to have to leave. She's going to have to resign on this. There will be real accountability. This is the ultimate mission for the Secret Service, is to be able to protect the president. And they were an inch away at that point from having a catastrophic failure for that, and still the death of one individual in the crowd.
It's absolutely unbelievable. I'd like to ask as well about another Homeland Security issue when it comes to the border, something we have heard a lot about.
I've worked
since
on a little bit.
Arriving in Milwaukee. And yes, indeed, sir, that you have. And we've heard, in fact, from some of your colleagues, like Senator Hagerty, who was here with us in the studio just a few days ago, suggesting that the deal that you had worked hard on, that the White House had agreed to, was never serious in the first place. Is anyone really still engaging in the serious conversation that you yourself tried so hard to engage in for months?
Yeah, I'm still working on this. I'm going to continue to be able to work on it. I have the unique position. I serve on the Intelligence Committee and Homeland Security Committee, so I have access to a lot of classified information to be able to see what's coming at us. And 2 years ago, there was a huge shift. There were fewer and fewer people from the Western Hemisphere, more people from China, Russia, West Africa, Pakistan, places that we don't normally get folks in, and it's criminal organizations internationally that have now become travel agents to be able to move people in. It was pretty obvious what was going to happen. They're going to start moving people in, and then they're going to move their people in. 2 months ago, we had 8 ISIS-affiliated individuals that were picked up in the United States and then deported from there. Why were they here in the first place? Because this facilitation network is now in place. So for me, I'm going to work with anyone who's willing to actually stop what Joe Biden is doing to the country right now. And if we could get Democrats together in the Senate to say we can change the definition for asylum, we can make this stop, I'm going to do it. And quite frankly, we had a young lady in Houston that was brutally raped and murdered just a month ago that could have been prevented if we'd actually shut the border down during that time in February. So there are things Joe Biden can do right now. He's had authority to be able to do. And
he's signed a few executive orders.
He has signed a few executive orders. They've slowed it, but they've also redefined the numbers as they're coming across. Everybody's talking about, well, the numbers are way down. Actually, what they've done is they've now defined if you come to a port of entry, they're not listing that in the main numbers. So they've changed the definition more than changed the actual quantity of people coming across. So that's one big challenge, is to actually push back on media that's saying, oh, the numbers have dropped, when they actually haven't dropped. They've just changed the way that they're counting it. There are executive actions that can be done. There's great frustration among Republicans to say, do what you can already do. But I'm telling you, if we don't change the way we define asylum, none of this gets better. So yes, it was a very serious proposal to be able to try to get us to resolution in the United States Senate. You've got to have 60 people agree to move something. That means Republicans and Democrats have got to sit down and talk about hard issues and make adult conversations into a dialogue about how do we solve it.
Well, I don't know where you get your patience from, Senator, but as I see the Republican Party platform, number one, the first item, seal the border and stop the migrant invasion, is the language. Does part of you want to walk in that room and say, I led you to water and you didn't want to drink? How does this get easier?
It doesn't get easier in the mindset. I would tell you, if President Trump is elected, or I can just go back and look at the 4 years previous, very different than what we've had the last 3.5 years. We've had more people illegally cross our southern border in the past 3.5 years than we had in the previous 12 years combined. And my statement to the Biden administration is, if you don't want to do the Trump policies, do the Obama policies. Do something. President Obama was a fraction of the number of people illegally crossing that we have under President Biden. So there are things that they could do. They should do right now. They're still choosing not to be able to do. But whatever, and whoever is elected in this November, and I hope it's President Trump, but whoever is elected in this November, they're still going to have an issue with the legal definition of asylum. What we had in that bill was doubling the number of deportation flights, dramatically increasing the number of Border Patrol, number of ICE agents, building more wall. We had things that every president's going to want, including changing this very loose definition of asylum that has been a pain to every president.
All right, Senator, it's great to have you with us here in Milwaukee. Thank you so much for your time. It's Republican Senator James Lankford of Oklahoma joining us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. We'll have more with the House Intelligence Committee Chair Mike Turner just ahead on Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, live from Milwaukee at the Republican National Convention. I'm Joe Mathieu, alongside Kailey Leinz. We thank you for joining us as we dig in for day 4, Kailey. Donald Trump tonight. This is the moment that he's been waiting for.
The first time he will address the country as the Republican nominee officially, once again, as he accepts that nomination. And, of course, the first time we will hear from him in a forum like this since he survived an assassination attempt in Pennsylvania last weekend. Yep,
that's right. Reports claim the U.S. had information about a plot from Iran, as we've told you, against Donald Trump. Iran denying those claims, calling them malicious, which may not be a surprise, but that is the reason, reportedly, why security was enhanced the day that this happened. And joining us now to talk about this, among other issues at this RNC, is Congressman Mike Turner, who chairs the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Mr. Chairman, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's great to see you here in Milwaukee, of all places. I hope the convention's going well for you, because we're talking about a lot of serious issues around this, including this matter. And I'd like to get your thoughts on Kimberly Cheadle and the questions that you have for the agency. But as the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, what can you tell us about this threat from Iran?
Sure. Well, you're absolutely right about the convention. The energy level is extraordinary. The convention is going very well. The people that are here are just so moved by Donald Trump's life having been saved and really the message that he's got coming out of this convention of reversing the Biden administration's policies on the border, national security, and of course the economic. With respect to the director for the Secret Service, obviously I have, other members of Congress have, the Speaker has called for her resignation. I think at this point it's important for President Biden to stand up. She needs fired. I mean, it's clear the agency is not working. It's inexcusable and outrageous, the failures that occurred. It could have resulted in the death of Donald Trump. They clearly were not adequately protecting him that day. You had Senator Lankford here who said they knew there was a threat before they let him on the stage. And as we all know, because we witnessed it, they didn't take out the threat. They didn't shoot the shooter until he had already shot Donald Trump, which could have been a fatal shot. With respect to this Iran threat, this has been publicly known that Iran was targeting former President Donald Trump and members of his cabinet in retaliation for the killing of Soleimani. Yesterday, when we received our briefing, I asked Director Wray, this has been a known, continuous, and existing threat. The new information that we have doesn't really give us any greater heightened threat. It's just an acknowledgement of the fact that the threat is continuing, and shouldn't have the security that was around Donald Trump already have baked in that level of threat. And he acknowledged, he said, yes, absolutely. And he himself, you could tell in his tone, he's surprised that the Secret Service was not responding, recognizing that there was a state actor threat, in addition to just the general threats that were out there to a presidential candidate.
Well, we've also heard from Director Wray this notion that we could see an increased risk of terror, whether lone wolf or otherwise, something that at the time he said it and since I think we've all found quite concerning. Is there a sense that what we saw take place in Pennsylvania on Saturday is something we could continually see as we move forward through this election cycle? Just how heightened is the security risk for even everyday Americans right now?
Sure, absolutely. You made an excellent point. As we know, Director Wray has gone around openly saying that the lights are flashing red, that we're the highest level of a threat for a potential terrorist attack since 9/11. And he specifically cites the border, that there have been people have been able to cross the border as a result of the Biden administration's policies that have affiliations with terrorist groups and organizations and intend to do Americans harm. That, as you just said, should also be factored into the protection that happens at these rallies, because it's not just the president, it's also the people attending. So that it is an increased threat. And it is one, I think, that also goes to the condemnation of the Biden policies for the border, that individuals have been allowed to come into the country that could perpetrate a terrorist attack.
As you arrive at the Capitol to work every day, security is a factor. With these recent developments, do members of Congress, once and for all, need to be provided a security detail?
Well, I don't know. I mean, several members do have security
based
details.
On threat level, but
right.
Shouldn't that be across the board at this point, Mr. Chairman?
I think that we're okay right now, and that when we're in secure places, there is security provided. I think the Capitol is secure, and I think that way we know that there's sufficient protection.
Well, the Capitol certainly, I would imagine, is going to have even increased security next week, because you're expecting a visit from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel. I feel like that has gotten lost in the shuffle of the developments of recent weeks as it comes to the presidential race. But it's a high-profile visit at a time where there is still a hot war raging in the Middle East. What does the latest intelligence suggest about the trajectory with which that war is moving, as we keep hearing what feel like head fakes about progress towards some kind of ceasefire agreement? Based off what you've heard, what are you expecting Netanyahu will say to you and your colleagues next week?
Well, I think he'll certainly assert the need for Israel to defend itself and the right for Israel to exist, and remind us of the horrendous terrorist attacks and the killing of innocent people and the taking of hostages that occurred, October 7th, and that even before that, Israel was living under a constant barrage of missile attacks that the Iron Dome would respond to, but nevertheless still resulted in loss of life and property in Israel as a result of these thousands of missiles that were being sent. Part of their entering into Gaza and trying to dismantle Hamas is, of course, dismantling that missile system, their capabilities to launch into Israel. I think his message is going to be very important, because he's also going to be hearing the messages back of both support, but that this needs to be resolved. I know Director Burns of the CIA has been doing shuttle diplomacy, attempting to get a deal with Hamas where we could have a period of ceasefire where the hostages could be released. Director Burns has been doing an excellent job in those negotiations.
Will Israel go to war with Hezbollah?
Clearly, again, Israel needs to be able to defend themselves, and there are again thousands of missiles that are in southern Lebanon
to keep
Israel. Right, and so there's that balance of how do you make certain that your adversary's capabilities can't be used to kill your population?
Mm-hmm. So that's one live war that's happening in the world. There's another happening on the European continent, and the vice presidential nominee, who we all heard speak last night, is a bit skeptical of the U.S. continuing to provide funding for Ukraine. Does the selection of J.D. Vance concern you when you think about the future trajectory of what Russia could do if victorious in Ukraine? Is there something that Senator Vance is missing here?
Well, if you listen to Donald Trump's campaign, and certainly the Trump family, why they say that J.D. Vance was picked because of his compelling story, which is an American story of success, and I think their attractiveness to that is really resounding, I think, with American people. I haven't seen many vice presidents that have a significant impact on foreign policy. And Donald Trump has been very clear that his effort is not to abandon Ukraine, but to end this war. And I think that's what we all want.
We've been talking a lot about Joe Biden and his not only health now as he's come down with COVID, but his mental acuity. You see all the reports that we see. It looks like he's lost the Hill, the Democratic leadership on the Hill. Is there a security component to this? As the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, do you worry about his state of mind and whether that presents a security problem for the United States? I'm sure I'll get lots of tweets about this, but is that a real question?
Absolutely. And this is what I've described it as, is that we really have this vacuum in the administration of decision-making, indecisiveness that has occurred. There are 5 to 10 major policy issues that are gumped up in the Oval Office for which we can't get decisions. Now, I think his national security team, which is a very good national security team, has sort of dissolved into a NATO-style committee where if they all agree, we get great policies. But if they don't agree, then action shuts down because we have indecisiveness coming from the commander-in-chief. And I think that's our greatest threat. If they walk into the Oval Office today and tell him, Mr. President, we have a crisis and we need you to make a decision, I'm not confident he can.
Are you confident that Kamala Harris could?
Well, I would be not confident as to the decisions she makes. If she does if she is presented with a decision to make and makes one, I think her policies would be much more dangerous than what we're seeing even out of this administration on foreign policy.
Yeah, I don't want to bring it too far down the road on hypotheticals, but if he actually leaves the race here, does that change the calculus for Republicans in this election cycle for Donald Trump or down ballot races?
Well, I don't think that, the Democratic Party is for an open border. They're for this out-of-control spending that has resulted in this high inflation.
So it's 6
and they've embraced, right, and they've embraced the abrupt withdrawal from Afghanistan that was resulted in, just total destabilization in the area, and have supported the Biden administration's restrictions that have been placed on President Zelensky in Ukraine that have resulted in this stasis, this stalemate, this unbelievable loss of life that's continuing to occur on Ukraine instead of allowing them to win. So I don't think, regardless of who they pick, that you're going to see a big policy shift. And that's what it would take, I think, for the American public. The American public want that border closed. They know, as Director Wray has said, they're less safe today because of what the Biden administration and the Democratic Party has done with the border.
Well, we heard about the border from Senator Vance in his acceptance speech last night, in part talking about the fentanyl that is crossing over. And he also drew a line not just to the border issue, but to the issue of China, something he spoke about quite passionately on multiple occasions during the speech. Let's just remind ourselves of a bit of what the vice presidential nominee had to say.
Now, thanks to these policies that Biden and other out-of-touch politicians in Washington gave us, our country was flooded with cheap Chinese goods, with cheap foreign labor, and in the decades to come, deadly Chinese fentanyl. Joe Biden screwed up, and my community paid the price.
Of course, Sir Senator Vance, Donald Trump have spoken out in favor of putting higher tariffs on goods coming from China. There's been a lot of conversation as to whether or not we're going down a road that could ultimately lead to a decoupling of our economies. How does the economics factor into the actual relationship and change the theater when we're thinking about the Pacific? If we're starting to cut China off more economically, does that actually make the world more dangerous because they may be less likely to cooperate with us?
Well, I think what you're seeing is, I mean, we already have a global, trade economy that I think has brought greater prosperity around the globe and even to the United States. But we see that we have gone too far. The vulnerabilities that were evident during COVID in our supply chain and our manufacturing, where we weren't making the things here that we need in order to be able to survive. And then the second is we have a great workforce that is underutilized, and it's underutilized because we've allowed jobs to leave that ought to be in the United States. And Senator Vance is actually, saying words that in Ohio are incredibly important. We've seen so many manufacturing jobs that have left that need to be brought back to the United States, and that's going to be an issue and certainly is a topic for this administration.
You're going to be in the hall tonight for Donald Trump's speech, I suspect?
Yes.
We just got the speakers lineup here. Dana White, Hulk Hogan. What's the message?
I think this, on that unity message, this really is the all-American team, right?
Wrestling leagues are uniting here?
Everybody's coming together, and I think they're coming together because they recognize that the Biden policy has been destructive to the United States, and the policies that Trump pursued in his first term, that he's going to pursue in his second term, will right that.
Is there anything you haven't heard from the speakers thus far, J.D. Vance or otherwise, that Donald Trump needs to address before this convention is over this evening?
You mean
in terms of policy? Obviously, we had foreign policy night last night. We've had an economic policy night as well. But the American people are voting on a number of different issues, knowing that, for example, on the Republican platform that was officially adopted, there was no federal abortion ban. Are we speaking to all of America when we're talking about unity here, or is there more that could be done to reach out to groups of voters that may not be all in on Donald Trump as the delegates assembled here are?
Well, I think what's also important in this is it's not just a document that's the platform for the Republican Party. It's that Donald Trump has a record. I mean, one of the things that you're going to hear tonight is that he's going to say not just this is what I think we ought to do to make America stronger again, to bring the economy back, to close the border and make certain that we're a safe country. He's going to be able to say, I was doing it. When Biden came in, it's not just that Biden won the election. It's that Biden reversed the policies, and now we have the detriment conditions as a result of what Biden did.
All right, Chairman, it was great to have you here in Milwaukee. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time. That is the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, Congressman Mike Turner of Ohio. We appreciate it. Now, we do want to take a quick check on the markets as the major indices once again are selling off after starting the day in positive territory. Let's get the latest with Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle in New York. Abigail?
Well, Kailey, yeah, it's not looking very good for stocks at this point. We do have the S&P 500, Dow, and NASDAQ all solidly lower. In fact, the NASDAQ 100 looking at its worst 2 days of the year, right now down about 0.7%. That's true, too, for the other two indexes. And we have something today that we did not have yesterday. And yesterday, of course, for some of the indexes was the worst day since 2022. That is real fear creeping into the picture. We can see this through the VIX index. This is a measure of uncertainty. It started off the week at a 12, so this has nothing to do with the assassination attempt on the former president. It has to do with some uncertainty, I would argue, around the current president. We now have it closer to a 16 handle. That is a really big move up. That's another way of saying that investors are not so complacent as they were before. And again, with the intensified pressure that we're hearing, reports about Democrats urging President Biden to step down, to step aside. We do have this spike on the VIX, in the VIX today. The laggards on the day, it has everything to do with what was selling off yesterday. We have chips down, and you mentioned earlier we had a rebound attempt earlier in the day. And actually right now we do have NVIDIA and Broadcom flipping back higher, which is interesting because lots of movement for those stocks. It wasn't so long ago that they had been down, but Apple and Amazon lower. Again, I would argue some of that has to do maybe with the JD trade, his talk about being tough around big tech, taking a chunk out of those stocks. But finally, let's check in on those odds around who may be our next president, the betting odds. This is really interesting. So now the betting odds, the predicted betting odds are saying that Donald Trump has a 64% chance. Joe Biden is now at a 13% chance. But in white, take a look at this. Kamala Harris now at a 30% chance. So this matches the spike that we saw saw in the VIX, this uncertainty around who might be on the Democratic ticket and the growing sense that it may not be President Joe Biden.
All right, Abigail Doolittle in New York, thank you so much.
Thanks, Abigail. Joining us now as we continue our coverage from the Republican National Convention here in Milwaukee is Congresswoman Ashley Hinson of Iowa. Great to see you here
Good morning.
in Milwaukee. We're still trying to thaw out from our trip to Iowa.
Yeah, that 22 below was a little brutal,
sure.
right?
It's really something, though, when you bring yourself back to that moment in time and where the Republican Party was, where the contest was, as we were chasing Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley around on the campaign trail. Yep. There was a night this week when they all spoke, and Doug Burgum was added to that list last night. Unity has been a theme here, we're told, but started to get a little chippy last night with Peter Navarro and some of the others. What are we going to get? Which Donald Trump are we going to get tonight?
Yeah, I think we're going to get a Donald Trump the unifier tonight. I think our message has been very clear this week. Republicans are united behind Donald Trump. Iowa takes its job, obviously, in vetting all the candidates every caucus season very seriously. First in the nation. We're so proud of that. And I think we've done a good job of that. Every candidate you heard speak on the floor last night, when I think about the Republican bench, the people who are serving all across the country, I'm so proud of the people who've stepped up to help execute on this agenda to move our country forward. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what we'll hear from President Trump tonight. And I'm sure he's had just an incredible week watching these speakers, but also reflecting on his life and his legacy and what he's experienced since Saturday.
Mm-hmm.
Well, of course, we'll all be watching as we look ahead to his speech this evening, but we also got a speech from his selection for vice president in J.D. Vance last night. We just played a little taste of it with Chairman Turner, the idea that he talked a lot about the working man, but also a lot about countering China.
Right.
I know you sit on the China Select Committee. I'm sure you have thoughts on how that relationship would move forward under a Trump-Vance administration. But knowing you also come from Iowa, do you worry about the repercussions of going harder on China on things like tariffs that could blow back on, say, American farmers with something done in retaliation?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Every economic lever we pull, China's going to try to pull something else, right? And so we have to be very deliberate in any tactic we take or any legislation we pass, right, to try to hold them accountable. I think what I've heard loud and clear from Iowans, whether they're farmers or manufacturers or just small business owners, is they're tired of getting ripped off. They're tired of being undercut by China. So it's our job to make sure we're being competitive and we're laying out the policies to do that. So our committee, that's been the sole focus, is to try to say, hey, what economic levers do we need to pull? What investments do we need to be making to reshore things? What do we need to be doing diplomatically to develop relationships around the world to counter the efforts by China? So whether it's chips or other manufacturing that we need to reshore here, that's been our focus. Fentanyl is a huge problem in this country, and our committee actually did put out a really in-depth report about what China's been doing, what they've been up to. They've been directly subsidizing production of fentanyl just for export, right? It's illegal for their own people to make it for their country, but just for export. That, I think, says everything you need to know about China's intentions. They want to flood the world with this poisonous, dangerous fentanyl.
There's something called the Farm Bill that's not getting enough talk because it's a pretty big deal, and I know it is for your farmers in Iowa. It's also a big deal for progressive Democrats who want to see higher allotments for SNAP, for food stamps, and things have been gummed up. Your colleague in the other chamber, Joni Ernst, told us there will be no new farm bill. We're going to have to kick this thing and maybe take another swing in a lame duck session. Is that how you see it?
Well, unfortunately, with the timing and that expiration of even our extension expiring in a few months, if you would have asked me 3 or 4 months ago, I was hopeful. The House has certainly passed its farm bill out of committee. I'm hopeful we're able to get it on the floor. But
what does that mean for farmers, though, in Iowa? What are they not going to get because of this? Well,
I think if we are able to do another extension, really this is about certainty for them, knowing where things stand. So we will absolutely be working on moving that forward. I will continue to hammer our leadership and say, hey, guys, we need to get this farm bill done. It's critical for them to have that certainty. But I would hope we are at least able to, knowing what we know about the dynamics in the Senate, get an extension passed sooner rather than later. I was actually out in the district, visited one of our FSA offices, for example. So they're the boots on the ground from USDA helping our farmers get access to the programs that they need. And they're like, we just don't want it to be the last minute, right? We can navigate this if we know what we're dealing with, and it's just about the questions, right? It's the uncertainty. So I'm hopeful we're able to get something done soon. And I care about all those programs, right? I care about the SNAP program and making sure that's funded in an appropriate manner. I serve on the Ag FDA subcommittee, and so we've been taking a look long term at how do we make people healthier? How do we reduce healthcare costs for everybody? How do we make sure people have access to the food they need? But also, how do we make sure our producers have access to the programs that they know and trust?
To get that done, though, do we have to wait until the election? Is this all going to happen in the lame duck session at the very end of the year?
I wish I had a crystal ball to tell you, but it's looking that way. So again, I'll be pushing to get the extension across the floor as quickly as we can, because it is a vital program, and I wish we would have gotten it done last year. But obviously, the dynamics are a little bit interesting right now in Congress, as always, right? Yeah.
That's a good thing, though, isn't it? This could be actually a very productive lame duck session, depending on how things go. You take the pressure of the election away, and look what happens.
Right. I think people will be more willing to make a deal, right, and come to the table and negotiate. And I think that's what we should be doing. And I think you've heard that a lot in the messages out of convention. Last night, they were saying, hey, we might not agree all the time, and that's okay. We can have and that's what JD said, right? We should be having those discussions. And so I think it's going to be critical that once we get past the election, we're able to put that aside and get these things done. I know as an appropriator, we got all 12 of our bills out of our House committee. I know that September 30th deadline comes the same day every year, and yet Congress still can't get its act together. So I'm hopeful that we're able to push those bills across and then get something done in the lame duck.
Well, as you speak about what we heard from J.D. Vance last night, something else we heard repeatedly with different phrasing is this idea that J.D. Vance and Donald Trump are not going to be in it for Wall Street or for big business. We kept hearing about the working man.
Yeah.
Is this a metamorphosis, if you will, of the Republican Party? Because we have traditionally thought of the Republican Party as the party of business. So has something fundamentally changed here?
I wouldn't say it's changed. What I would say is I think we're trying to help a rising tide lifts all ships, right? That's kind of what we're looking at least my perspective is we need to be focused on policies that help lift up every American, no matter what walk of life you're from. What I appreciate about JD, especially the senator and hopefully our next vice president as this pick is I think he has so much context to draw from in terms of helping guide President Trump in the agenda. Don Jr. spoke a little bit about that, right? So he's, from Trump Tower, and then you've got JD from Middletown, Ohio, right? So, and they're going to be working together to advance this agenda for all walks of life. So I'm inspired by that. I'm a 41-year-old mom of 2 boys, and JD's a 39-year-old dad to 3, right? So I love that we've got kind of a good old-fashioned working parent coming in as our potential vice president this cycle.
It was remarkable listening to Don Jr. last night talk about this kid from Trump Tower becoming close friends with a kid from Appalachia. I guess there's something poetic about that, but how can you be an economic populist if you're a billionaire?
Well, I think you work with everyone, right? We've seen, I don't know if you've read Trump's books, but I read The Art of the Deal after he was our nominee in 2016, because I wanted to know kind of how he thought.
Sure.
And I think you see a man who has gone down and had those conversations with all the people who build his buildings. He's been there for the working man, and I think that's exactly how that happens, and that's what we're seeing out of both President Trump and out of our vice presidential pick.
Well, I suspect you're going to have a big night in the hall tonight, and it's great to talk to you before you get in there. Thank you.
I'm pretty fired up, so it's great to be here.
I can see that. Representative Ashley Hinson of Iowa, thank you for being part of our conversation and our coverage today on Bloomberg. Of course, the other story we're following here on another split-screen day, Kailey, is the situation involving Joe Biden. He's been sidelined with COVID and now calls from Capitol Hill leadership for him to drop out of the race.
Indeed, and a new one now, or a new report at least, coming from the AP, that Pelosi has warned Biden his candidacy may stop Democrats from winning the House. This, of course, echoes what we have heard from other outlets, including CNN. In just the last 24 hours, it's been incredibly difficult for the incumbent president.
That's true, who, of course, says he's staying in this race and still has many supporters. We spoke with one yesterday, the mayor of Milwaukee, where we sit now, Cavalier Johnson, talked to us about the impact the RNC on the city and his own support for Joe Biden. Here's part of that conversation.
There's only one person in the United States who has ever beaten Donald Trump in a political contest, and his name is Joe Biden. He has an outstanding record to run on over the course of the last 3 years, and he's got tremendous plans for a second term. This also reminds me of what happened in 2020 during the Democratic primaries, right? We had people on the front end who voted, and then we said, hey, why don't we let the diversity in the Democratic Party speak? And then South Carolina came, and Joe Biden had all the support in the world, and now he's president of the United States. So let's allow for minorities, for African Americans, particularly African American women, to speak in this election. But the data would suggest that more and more they are turning away from President Biden. Well, you don't believe that? Well, I can tell you this. I go out and I speak to my constituents. We were having a conversation just about festivals and things like that on the ground in this city. I go out to all those festivals and I engage with voters, particularly African-American voters and African-American male voters too. I ask them the question about the election coming up. Just real talk. Are you voting? Are you registered? Some say yes, some say no. Many of them have said yes, and I say, okay, who are you voting for? Just real talk, just me and you. Sure. And they say, we're voting for President Joe Biden. There is no other person to vote for. And there's reasons for that, because they know that Joe Biden has delivered for black people in this city and in this state and across the country. And they know what they would get under a second Trump presidency. Yeah. And so my understanding from talking directly with my constituents is that they are voting for President Joe Biden. Part of our conversation with the mayor of Milwaukee, Cavalier Johnson, as we are all here gathered for the Republican National Convention. It's, of course, day 4, and we're awaiting Donald Trump to accept the nomination officially and speak later tonight. So joining us now as we look ahead is Bloomberg Opinion's senior executive editor, Tim O'Brien. Tim, we also want to talk to you about what's going on in Biden world, but the fact is we are here in Republican world very much this week. Donald Trump, in leading up to his speech, has suggested he is making changes in the aftermath of the attempted assassination. Last week, it was supposed to be a humdinger, he said. Now it's going to be about unity. Knowing what we know about Donald Trump, do you think he can stick to that message throughout this entire speech this evening?
I think watch your watch. He may during the speech. I think Donald Trump is not normally disciplined around his own habits or strategically on the political landscape, but he has been, he was very on point during the debate. I think he sort of let Joe Biden belly flop all by himself during the debate. He had the presence of mind in the aftermath of the assassination attempt to pump his fist and create a very, epic, telegenic moment. But after like day 1 this week, the unity message started to get sort of churned out the window. Stefanik came on stage and sort of ate unity alive. Ron DeSantis ate unity alive. I think Donald Trump will probably, I think that the Republicans and the people managing the RNC have been very shrewd about how performative this event is. They've kept abortion off to the side. They've done outreach to veterans, outreach to people of color, outreach to the Jewish community. You had Sean O'Brien of the Teamsters give a speech that in any other season would be seen as something for the DNC, not the RNC. But, I'm going to wait and watch beyond the convention to see, does this actually, if Trump gets elected, does this become part of how the Republicans govern from the White House? And I do not think peace, unity, and kumbaya are going to be what the Trump White House will be about.
Well, of course, you know Donald Trump better than most people ever will. You wrote the book on Trump. Trump Nation, The Art of Being the Donald. Bring us inside your imagination on the stagecraft tonight, because we're talking about a showbiz genius in Donald Trump. I remember 16 when the curtain came up. What was it? Queen was playing.
And the blue
We Are the
smoke.
Champions. Yeah, the silhouette. Real powerful optics. I've been looking at people in the hall here with bandages on their ears. To what point or what extent are they going to leverage show business tonight?
To the full extent. They've got such great momentum this week. I think the assassination attempt, thankfully, it was unsuccessful. And I think that he and everyone organizing this event is capitalizing on the goodwill, I think, that came out of it, that he wasn't killed. And then this kind of Teddy Roosevelt bravado is also something they're building on. And Donald Trump is a media addict. He lives for the spotlight. He is not a strategic thinker. He's not a particularly sophisticated thinker, but he understands symbolism and emotion and performance in his bones. So I think you're going to see a lot of that tonight. I think he's going to get introduced by Dana White. cage fighting specialist.
After Hulk Hogan.
After Hulk Hogan.
There's this
there's
cage match convention.
It'll be interesting to see how the kind of handoff to Trump goes. But he's come in the other nights he's been in, he's done sort of a WWF entrance through the tunnel. So he's very aware of that. So yeah, I think you'll definitely see some of that. And it plays to his strengths. It would be a good capstone for a good week that they've had here in Milwaukee.
Well, if it's been a good week for Trump in Milwaukee, it's been a pretty rough week for Joe Biden elsewhere.
Yes, it has been.
A positive COVID-19 test yesterday that has now sidelined him. He's isolating in Delaware, reporting now from multiple outlets about senior Democratic leaders in Congress, Pelosi, Schumer, telling him not only that he probably can't win, but that he will drag other Democrats down with him. New polling out from Emerson today. Trump ahead in all 7 swing states and in Virginia. Is it over, Tim?
I don't know that it's over. I think that Joe Biden should do the right thing and step aside. I've said that in 2 columns since the debate. I think he did a great service in a perilous time to take the country across a bridge from a very troubled post-COVID economy and post-COVID society into the economy's been booming, that we have rational people in the federal government. And I think a year ago he probably should have said, I've done my service. I'm going to hand this off to someone else. He didn't do that, and I think the clock ran far too long. Yeah. I think the party has been pushing him quietly to move along, and he didn't move along. And I think it's unsettling that it appears that one of the gatekeepers around this decision is his son Hunter. That doesn't bode well for the decision-making process. Some of his other gatekeepers are veterans like Mike Donnellan, but I think they're protective, as opposed to thinking strategically what's good for the down-ballot races in the party. And I think now that this stuff's becoming public, I think it shows the extent to which, the pressure's really moving in on him.
We only have a minute left. If he does drop out of this race, are Democrats going to look beyond Kamala Harris, or do they need to quiet talk of alternatives?
And I think Kamala Harris, for a variety of reasons, has to be the first pick. Yeah. I think what will be really interesting is who her running mate might be. That the Democrats should be smart about that. And I think if they have the right lineup there, you're going to see this race reanimated, and some of that swing state dynamic might shift a little bit.
Really great to have you in Milwaukee.
Thank you for having me. It's a
Enjoy
privilege.
night 4 here. Bloomberg Opinions. Tim O'Brien. Find his work on the terminal, OPIN Go, and of course online. Kailey, we've got a lot coming up in this next hour. On the second hour of Balance of Power, live from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, including Republican Congressman Jason Smith, the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee. We've got a lot more, so stay with us right here. Alongside Kailey, Leinz, I'm Joe Mathieu on Bloomberg TV and radio. Live from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, day 4 of the Republican National Committee. And we're glad you joined us. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz. And we come together at a remarkable moment in political history here, Kailey, as Donald Trump prepares to accept his party's nomination tonight. Joe Biden is sidelined with COVID, with calls from the leadership on Capitol Hill, Democrats, for him to drop out of this race.
Yeah, and of course, this is as new polling from Emerson suggests that Biden is still lagging by an even greater margin behind Donald Trump in all 7 key swing states. Yeah. And another state that we don't typically consider to be swing, the state of Virginia, where, according to Emerson's polling, Donald Trump is ahead by 2 points. It's been a pretty rough week for Joe Biden, and Donald Trump is about to cap a pretty good week from him, of course, that began with surviving an attempted assassination.
So once again, over the next hour, we'll be following the bead on both of these parallel storylines. And with us now, Bloomberg's Julie Fine and Gregory Cordy as part of our coverage from Milwaukee. Great to see both of you. Welcome to day 4. This is the big night here, Julie. Donald Trump, after what we heard last evening from Don Jr., from Peter Navarro, a little bit of a darker shade on the unity message here, more red meat. Does that continue tonight? What are they going to hear from their savior?
Well, it will be very interesting because he keeps preaching unity, unity, unity. If you want to look at J.D. Vance last night, he had his moments certainly with the red meat on the policy, but a very measured tone, this is my life, this is who I am. I think you're going to see from the former president tonight a little bit of the red meat, but I think he too will try to talk about his personal story in his life, tap into the emotion of it, and see how that resonates with his base.
Well, as we consider what we heard from J.D. Vance last night, and you're absolutely right, Julie, it was very measured, and he was very specific with who he was trying to speak to. The working man, not Wall Street or big business. Workers in specifically Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. He's going for the Rust Belt, Gregory, and he made that abundantly clear.
Yeah, he name-checked those specific states a number of times, and he included Ohio in there. That's the home state. But what he's saying is, look, I come from the Rust Belt. I represent Rust Belt values. I know how the economy has failed people in the industrial north of this country, and I can diagnose the problem so that I can fix the problem. And he went way back to at least the great financial crisis, or if not before, to say it started with Wall Street, and that's what started all the dominoes tumbling with unemployment, with immigration, with all of the things we've seen in this country over the past 15, 20 years to bring us to this moment. It was interesting, sort of brought us back to what brought Trump to prominence in the first place. So much has happened over the past 8 years, so much with Trump rhetoric, and it was sort of a back to the roots of the Trump movement.
Great reporting this morning that J.D. Vance's campaign plane has a decal ready, but it's not in Milwaukee. When he gets back to life here in Washington, he's going to hit the road. To what extent will the campaign leverage J.D. Vance to travel while Joe Biden is sidelined?
Well, I think J.D. Vance is going to be in the states that you just mentioned. Yeah. He is the swing state guy, and he is going to capitalize on the Rust Belt. Guy, yeah. So I think that is where you're in smaller cities, too. I don't think you're necessarily going to see him in the capital. I think you're going to see him in the Rust Belt, small towns. He will be telling his story. I mean, I noticed last night when he said hillbilly. And that was certainly to capitalize on his story in his book so that people, then turn around, buy the book and learn more about him. So I think you will see him in those areas predominantly. I think you will see the former president in bigger cities.
Well, and as he introduced himself to a larger swath of the country last night, he also introduced the country to his mother at one point, who was there in the hall, seated next to the Speaker of the House in the box of Donald Trump. It was a very moving moment. I was there on the floor. I think it was emotional.
Chanting JD's mom.
JD's mom was getting the chants in the room. Pretty remarkable. But if we could just return, we're here on Bloomberg TV and radio. We are the channel of business. To the other things we heard from J.D. Vance about not being for big business, calling out Wall Street barons. For a Republican Party that traditionally has been pro-business, is this not just an evolution of like a Trump movement, but an evolution of the party itself as no longer being business friendly? And if it's not Republicans, Gregory, is there a business-friendly group of the American political class?
Yeah, and what's remarkable is that for all we've just been talking about with J.D. Vance's humble origins life story, he also spent years in San Francisco working on tech and venture capital. So he knows this world. And it's a very interesting sort of juxtaposition of understanding that world, but also being sort of offering a critique of it. He says he's pro-tech, but anti-big tech. He's for what he calls little tech, right? He wants the startups to have a shot. He's against Wall Street, but he's for small business. And so he's going to have to kind of do a little bit of a dance here. He wants to go after congressional or campus college endowments and tax those, right? And so he really... It's attacking in a different way, but he's going to the wealth of this country and portraying sort of an anti-elite kind of message. Yeah, that's comes out a slightly different way from the Democratic critique of capitalism, but it is still a critique of capitalism.
I want to turn you both to what's happening with Joe Biden right now. The leaks are getting hot and heavy because he has not been responding, apparently, to private conversations. We're talking Pelosi, Schumer, Jeffries pushing him to that point. Now you add COVID. And the White House released a letter from the doctor yesterday, which is what you do at times like these, invoking or describing his symptoms, a runny nose, a cough, and general malaise. Indeed, invoking Jimmy Carter. Are we serious? Do they need an editor to work with the doctor?
Well, it's been just one piece of bad news after another, of course, for Joe Biden. And this clearly doesn't help. And we already have this national image of an old and tired president, and now he's old, tired, and sick. And unfortunately for him, when you're president, you can't really avoid the glare of the spotlight. And so we saw him get on the plane, get off the plane last night, looking tired. It recalled that moment when President Trump had COVID, came back or went to Walter Reed to get treatment, and looked, if I can say, terrible. That's not what Americans want to see in their president, and it's going to renew all of these questions that were already swirling the campaign. It's just really unfortunate timing for Joe Biden.
Well, and on the timing, it's happening simultaneously with the Republican National Convention, in which Republicans, including J.D. Vance last night, are spending a lot of time attacking Joe Biden. What has to change for everyone gathered here in Milwaukee if it is not Joe Biden leading the Democratic ticket, leaving it?
Well, I think, first of all, to return to your point about the general malaise, over and over again, I hear from people, I'm sure all of you do too, who is advising them? How is this message, like you look at the message of the Republican Party, somehow they are able to sell to people, we're for the little man. And then you've got the president who rides the train. I mean, and they can't sell that message. So, and now you wonder in this situation, you know, who is speaking to them. So here you have everybody. I can't tell you, you were on the floor last night, so have I been, how many people saying, well, we don't even know who he's going to be running against. Like here, people already think this is a done deal. This is decided. These are a crucial few days coming up for President Biden. But here's another thing you have to remember. If he does decide to make a change, he has COVID. You're not going to run in from people are, you know, you're not going to run in front of a camera in the next day or two. I think the Democratic Party has bought themselves some time to figure out what they're going to do next. And the more that does get leaked or the more information that gets out about President Biden, it is taking some focus away from the Republicans.
Yeah, well, time is everything, because 1 month from today, we won't all be here sitting in Milwaukee. We'll be in Chicago at the Democratic Convention. Everything has a clock. Julie Fine and Gregory Cordy, thank you both so much for joining us as we turn now to Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, who has a closer look at a preview of what we might hear in Donald Trump's speech tonight. Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Kailey. First, some clues on how former President Trump might approach his speech tonight. We've been talking a lot about how J.D. Vance approached his speech last night, reaching out directly to some voters in some key battleground states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, all places that President Biden won in 2020 and that Trump needs to win this time around. As you've been covering on Balance of Power, a new Emerson College poll out today shows former President Trump leading in 7 key battleground states. And the Trump campaign also announced that former President Trump and J.D. Vance will make their first official appearance as the presidential and vice presidential nominee over the weekend at a rally in Michigan. But when we really look at the messaging towards targeting some of these battleground state voters, it was interesting to see J.D. Vance last night put forward this more populist message, often using it actually as a segue to talk about China. I want you to take a listen here to how he was talking about that competition and framing that message to battleground state voters.
We're going to build factories again, put people to work making real products for American families made with the hands of American workers. Together, we will protect the wages of American workers and stop the Chinese Communist Party from building their middle class on the backs of American citizens.
We know shortly after accepting the vice presidential nomination, J.D. Vance called China, quote, the biggest threat the U.S. is facing, and that former President Trump has already started to preview some of his policies, including tightening tariffs when it comes to China. So Joe and Kailey will be watching for that tonight. Also, we do know that after that assassination attempt over the weekend, former President Trump said that he did rewrite his speech to include more unity. So these are some of the themes that we can expect later this evening.
That's great. Tyler Kendall reporting for Bloomberg here at this Republican National Convention. Tyler, thank you. Tyler will be with us for our special coverage this evening that we invite you to here starting 8 p.m. Eastern Time as Donald Trump has his big speech on this night for Kailey, accepting his party's nomination. We've got a lot to experience today, and with us along for the ride as well, our signature panel, Rick Davis of Stonecourt Capital, with us right now, and Bloomberg contributor Jeanne, Zaino, political science professor, Iona University. Great to see you both. Welcome to day 4. It's the big night. Rick, you've been there with your own candidate before, and I wonder what you're expecting. We saw the biggest and longest standing ovation of this entire convention before J.D. Vance got on the stage, when Peter Navarro showed up, hours after being released from prison. He delivered the full retribution package I went to jail so you didn't have to. If they got me, they're coming for you, Jeanne. Blood on his hands, Alejandro Mayorkas. Which message do we get tonight, that or the unity?
You know, I think it's going to be a combination of factors. I think Donald Trump, because of the unique situation he finds himself in, just surviving an assassination attempt, has got to address that, right? And that can't be anything but a unity comment. But I don't think this convention has been the unity convention by any stretch of the imagination. If anything, it'd be much more Navarro than unity.
Okay.
And so I don't think they're going to stray too much from the tried and true Donald Trump testimony tonight. You know, his grievances, his views are going to be in full display, just like they are at his rallies. And when I see the lineup of other speakers tonight, this is not the unity group, right? I mean, this is blood and guts, WWE, you know.
Quite literally.
Yeah, so I think we're going to see more of the standard show. And frankly, that's what I'm a little disappointed. I kind of was entertained by Navarro, but so far it's not been that exciting a convention.
Well, so on this idea of unity, it's not just that they're trying to unify the party, but they're trying to bring more people in with them, at least in theory, right? I have heard so much about the big tent since being here in Milwaukee. Has anyone been able to accomplish that? As J.D. Vance last night specifically just talked to Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio as well, looking at the Rust Belt, looking at workers. Do you think anyone has been drawn in? Or it's just solidified the people that were already here in the first place?
You know, I think there have been good speeches sprinkled among them. I don't think J.D. Vance's speech last night was as effective as I thought it would be. To your point, he did reach out to these Rust Belt states. He kept calling them out. But, you know, you listen to J.D. Vance, I think the most effective speakers, quite frankly, have been Donald Trump's granddaughter yesterday. She was adorable. She made him feel, you know, be like this warm grandfather. But then to your point, Peter Navarro, that is who they are playing to. And this gets back to what I think is a big problem for Donald Trump. He has a ceiling that at least at this point seems pretty solid at 47%. So I will admit, not the best of times for the Dems. But the fact that Joe Biden is arguably going to be off this ticket pretty soon, and, you know, it's not a matter of if at this point, but when. That is not good news for Donald Trump because he has a ceiling, and unless he is unifying tonight and people feel like he is a different man than the one we've gotten to know, you are hard-pressed to imagine that the people who are saying they are never Trump all of a sudden turn around and decide they're going to vote for him.
Interesting. I think one of the most underrated speeches of the night was J.D. Vance's wife, Yusha. Really remarkable moment for her and that crowd. She introduced him, of course. I just want to go back, though, to this idea of Hulk Hogan, Dana White performing or speaking here. It's not exactly a highbrow message. Rick, does Donald Trump tear his shirt open? They're actually going to be leading into his speech.
Yeah, this is obviously Dana White and Hulk Hogan aren't reaching across the political divide to suburban housewives.
Right. So it's the fight, fight, fight message, and we'll see the image of Donald Trump. That's kind of the optic that we're going to have.
I mean, we've seen this before, right? He's gone to these events, you know, these WWE events, and it's all loud music and pumping and getting your blood going. And by the way, the crowd has been great. If I had to say the one thing that has saved all these speakers, including J.D. Vance last night, wasn't the speeches or the performances. It's the crowd. They have been electric. They get the message. And they saved the speech last night, and they will elevate Trump's speech tonight. This is going to be the most interactive night that we've seen, and I would expect this is going to be uber high testosterone, you know, but it's the base. They're going to leave here, both the people in the Coliseum and everyone who is already a Trump supporter and saying, that's the guy we love. The rest of America is going to be scratching their head going, I didn't see anything there for me.
Wow.
Well, there's other reasons why the rest of America may be scratching their head, including trying to figure out whether or not they're going to have the option to vote for Joe Biden or Donald Trump in November. Jeanne, you were just alluding to this. You think it's a matter of when, not if. Yet his campaign is speaking on MSNBC right now, suggesting that actually they still think they're on track to victory. They will not release the polling that shows that path to victory. So take that as you will. But seeing what we have seen develop in the last 24 hours, the calls, public or not, as there's been reported from Democratic leadership, a positive COVID-19 test, Jeanne, if it is a matter of when does this happen strategically, what time is the opportune time, knowing you're running against a very, very ticking clock here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably going to be over the weekend.
While he's isolating,
get ready not to rest, folks. I think he's not only isolating physically, but emotionally and mentally as well. This has been Shakespearean. You guys know that better than I do, all the metaphors. But I do think the worst thing that happened yesterday for the Biden campaign, there was a lot, was Jeffrey Katzenberg coming out and telling them the money is drying up, and not only for your race, but for the down ballot races. That is a disaster for Democrats. Also a disaster, this drip, drip, drip. The party is going to have to respond. Why were you keeping this a secret from the American public? Thankfully, the American public, at least Democrats, have been telling us for a long time in polls that they know what's going on. But this is a disaster all around. He's got to get out sooner rather than later and let the party move forward, because this is a winnable race for Democrats, but he can't be at the top of the ticket. And they're not releasing data because the data shows that he can't pull this off at this point.
He waved to reporters on the tarmac, said, "I feel good." He was trying to yell over the noise on the runway there. But Rick, did you see him on the stairs?
Yeah, the pictures are horrible.
Does it matter
right?
what he says?
I mean, look, he's 81 years old. He walks like an 81-year-old. It is what it is, right? And he shouldn't be criticized for that. It's who he is. And arguably he's had a great 3-year run in the presidency. But as a candidate, it takes more stamina. That's just a fact. And at his, advanced age, he's not meeting the demands that his party is giving him. And it's fair for them to then say, it's time for you to move, back in line so that we can put a, team together on the field of play who can handle the rigors of a campaign. Campaigning is hard. And so unless Joe Biden was prepared to meet that challenge, he should himself take himself out.
All right, Rick Davis of Stonecourt Capital and Bloomberg contributor Jeanne Zaino of Iona University will be with us throughout the day as we broadcast to you live from Milwaukee as we're talking about Biden. A spokesperson for Speaker Emerita Pelosi says her talks with him have been misrepresented. We'll have more ahead. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, live from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. It is day 4, and we're awaiting the speech from soon-to-be officially accepted Republican nominee for president, former President Donald Trump. And of course, as we have continued to remind our audience, the first time we are hearing from him on camera since surviving an assassination attempt last weekend.
Yeah, this is the headliner, and the moment that all these delegates have been waiting for. J.D. Vance last night, the former president tonight. We've seen a rundown on the list of speakers. He'll be preceded by Dana White and Hulk Hogan, of all people, with, I guess the message is fight, 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 as we've been hearing chants on the floor of this convention after that attempted assassination on Saturday.
Yeah, chants of fight, fight, fight. Other chants as well that relate to policy, like drill, baby, drill. Yeah. I was hearing a lot from some energy states delegates last night. It certainly has been a highly energetic convention, and not one without pretty robust policy discussion as well. And we want to continue that now and bring in Missouri Republican Congressman Jason Smith, the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, who is here with us on set in our studios in Milwaukee. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for being with us. Among the policy discussions that have been focused on this week, and certainly for us here at Bloomberg, is tax policy. That is your arena. You were able to pass through the House by a wide bipartisan margin a bill much earlier this year. Expand the child tax credit, tax breaks for businesses as well, stalled out in the Senate. Can we first start by asking you, before we even look ahead to what comes in January 2025, whomever is president, is there a chance that can happen with this Congress still?
Absolutely. The tax agreement that you're referring to was a bipartisan effort between Senator Ron Wyden from Oregon and myself, two members of Congress that are not alike politically, but we found the common ground. And in fact, it proved that it was common ground because it passed the House of Representatives in January with 84% of the vote. For anything to pass the United States House of Representatives with 84%, we got 5 more votes than the TikTok bill. So I was quite happy with that. But what I will say is hearing what Leader Schumer has said in the last couple of weeks, he's going to He's going to bring it up to the floor for a vote. And I believe the votes are there. So it's good. It will help millions of Americans. It will fix several of the tax provisions that have expired from Trump's tax cuts, such as 100% expensing research and development, which is a really important aspect. There's an interest deductibility provision, but then it also does some good stuff on the child tax credit.
Mm-hmm. So you fast forward to the debate surrounding the 2017 tax cuts, and you've got a really busy year ahead. Mr. Chairman, we've had a long-running debate here, and I know it's going to continue. Kevin Brady has been speaking to us about this, so has Maya McGinnis. And there are questions about how you make all of this happen. I know that there's an effort to increase defense spending. Nobody wants to touch Social Security or Medicare, but we want to make the tax cuts permanent. And if that's all that happens, potentially add a good amount of money to our deficit in the trillions, once again, which I don't think is something that you want to see. So then the question becomes, what to cut?
It's a big discussion. Passing and addressing the expiring tax provision of 2025 is going to be a very, very huge task. In fact, it's the biggest tax cliff our country has ever seen, $4.3 trillion that will be expiring. Every American will face a tax increase if Congress does nothing. We also have a national debt at $34.5 trillion. So we're going to have to get very serious about looking at what is the optimum tax rate for certain individuals, what can help grow the economy, and what can also fund government, and make sure that all the things that are properly and necessarily needed to fund government. I think in a very bipartisan fashion, you see people wanting to protect and preserve Social Security and Medicare. We're concerned about both of those programs because by 2032 to 2033, both of them become insolvent. And so these are programs important to all Americans, but it's going to have to be addressed in a bipartisan fashion. One party cannot do it. It will never stick if not both of them are at the table.
A number of our colleagues here at Bloomberg had the chance to sit down with former President Trump a few weeks ago in Mar-a-Lago for a Bloomberg Business Week piece in which he suggested to them he would like to see a corporate tax rate of 15%. So we're going 6 percentage points lower. Is that realistic, Mr. Chairman, given everything you just said about still needing to be able to make sure government is funded appropriately?
There's a lot of things on the table. I think the biggest priority when you look at businesses is Section 199A. It's called the Main Street deduction. It's for pass-through subchapter S's, LLCs, which make up about 70% of all businesses in America, mainly small businesses. They have a 20% deduction that was passed in the 2017 tax code that would help give them about the equivalent tax rate as a C corporation, which is at 21%. That expires at the end of 25. That has to be our top priority when we're looking at addressing business taxes. The corporate tax rate, I'm someone who would always love lower taxes.
So 15% maybe sounds good?
I love low taxes. The president, he loves to make deals, and he knows the art of a deal, and so maybe he wants somewhere between 15 and 21. He would take 10 though. So we got a lot of things to navigate. Every individual tax rate increases. Every tax bracket increases. The child tax credit, which is something that is in the Republican Party platform, goes from $2,000 to $1,000. The standard deduction, which 91% of Americans use to file their taxes, it gets cut in half.
Remember the drive to put the tax code on a postcard to simplify this so people understand what we're talking about here, can predict their own finances. Could that happen under Trump 2.0?
Everyone would love to streamline the tax system.
Reform.
Well, we would back in 2000.
Could this Congress even handle it?
2017, when we tried to pass the Trump tax cuts, we wanted it to be put on a postcard. It's difficult. There's a lot of interest. Everyone likes their tax provision. Everyone likes their tax deduction. If we didn't have any deductions and any special tax provisions, you wouldn't even need a postcard. You could just do it like that.
Well, maybe it's not realistic then. Maybe that should not be the aim to oversimplify this.
I think there's a way we can streamline it. I believe the standard deduction actually is a great way that moves more towards doing it on a postcard. And 91% of Americans do the standard deduction. That means they take 0 tax deductions.
Mr. Chairman, we were all struck by polling that we got in today from Emerson that shows Donald Trump in the lead, not just in the 7 swing states, the known swing states, also in Virginia. There's been a lot of conversation about other states like Minnesota, potentially even New York and New Jersey being more up for grabs for Republicans this cycle. So it's with that in mind that I ask you, what about the SALT cap?
So the SALT cap is always a fun discussion. Glad you brought that up. I hear it every day. I've heard it every day up here from my New York and New Jersey friends. You know, we're going to have to find a balance. There's absolutely going to have to be a balance. That SALT cap was put in place at $10,000 per family. And that raised about $800 billion. And that's what they used to help lower the individual rates and actually to extend the child tax credit. And so that expires as well. So at the end of 2025, the SALT cap is unlimited. So it's no longer a $10,000 cap. It's millions if necessary. There's no cap. So that's going to be a big part of the discussion in the tax cuts. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of negotiation with our friends in New York and New Jersey. And if the elections go well and more Republicans come from New Jersey and New York, we're going to hear even more about it.
It's pretty loud already, that's for sure. I'll tell you, Mr. Chairman, you come on Bloomberg and start talking about SALT, the terminal's going to blow up here in a minute. I'm just waiting to see the headlines. Where's Donald Trump on this? Do you know?
I don't know where he is, but he signed the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. That was his legislation, and it put the cap. But also understand that the Trump tax cuts was $5.5 trillion worth of tax cuts, and $4 trillion was within it, and according to joint tax, that was paid for by eliminating various deductions, changing provisions such as the SALT tax cut. So it's gonna be interesting in how to navigate this process.
We're talking literal taxes here, obviously, but another conversation we've been having a lot in Milwaukee is about the protectionist policies that both Donald Trump and Vice Presidential nominee J.D. Vance seem to be advocates for, including higher tariffs on China that have been described to us here at Bloomberg as another form of a tax on the American consumer. The Peterson Institute for International Economics suggests it would cost the average middle-income household an additional $1,700 a year. Should we be thinking about tariffs as another kind of tax as well?
We should absolutely look at tariffs as a way to make sure that the American worker, the American farmer, the American manufacturer is treated fairly. If you look at what happened when Trump was president from 2016 to 2020, he elevated a lot of significant tariffs on China. And people were doom and gloom, said it was going to destroy the economy, and it led to the best economy in my lifetime in 4 decades.
But he's talking 60% now.
He's talking to make sure, like I said, Donald Trump is a negotiator. He's talking about making sure that the American worker, the American manufacturer, and the American farmer is taken care of and not taken advantage of. Think about this. When Trump was president, agriculture trade was at a $5 billion surplus. Right now, it's at a $21 billion deficit under President Biden. That is detrimental to U.S. farmers and ranchers, and it's because of the policies that have basically lapsed or not been implemented.
So think about all the things that we've been talking about here. The impact of tariffs. We've got, of course, the impact of interest rates. Inflation is such a major component here. The rent is too damn high. What's Donald Trump going to actually do to lower prices?
I think it's a good way to look at back in 2016 and 20 what he did. When he left office, inflation was at 1.4%, and it was under 2% for the prior 24 months.
Stayed there without COVID?
And I absolutely believe that because COVID was mainly over. What fueled inflation, if you even look at the charts, is right after the American Rescue Plan was passed in the 3rd month of President Biden's office. $2 trillion spending bill. Even Larry Summers, Democrat economist, said this money was not necessary, and it put too much money in the market that led to 20.1% increase in inflation since Joe Biden took the oath of office. That has affected. So to pull that money out, stop the spending, continue to make cuts. There's a lot of money that's still sitting in the coffers and in mandatory spending that came from the American Rescue Plan, that came from the Inflation Reduction Act, that we should look at and we should cut.
Of course, I've heard you speak President Biden's name a number of times during this conversation. Simultaneously, that we are all here gathered in Milwaukee, things do seem to be snowballing, if you will, when it comes to his reelection campaign. More and more calls for him to drop out. What needs to change for your party if it is not Joe Biden at the top of the Democratic ticket?
I would really hope the party that advocates for democracy is what the Democrats do, that they would disenfranchise 14 million Democrat primary voters. That's who they picked. There was other people running for office. They picked Joe Biden.
But if it's Joe Biden's choice to step aside.
If it's Joe Biden's choice, it's fine. But the only reason why all the leaders are calling for his resignation is because it's a political issue, not a medical issue. Because how Joe Biden has acted in the last 6 months is the same he's acted for the last 3 years. They've done a very good job at hiding it. And so it's a political issue because they think they're going to lose. And they want to find someone who can win. That is wrong. That would be disenfranchising 14 million American voters.
So that's going to be the Republican message, though. You're stuck with them.
That is my message.
Wow.
Because that's unacceptable. But if he wants to go, you know, it's their choice if they want to disenfranchise 14 million voters. That's their choice. But Republicans believe in making sure that every vote's counted.
Well, you just said that this is political because they believe that Joe Biden will lose. Do you have the same degree of confidence about Donald Trump's ability to defeat any other Democrat as you do the confidence that he can defeat Joe Biden?
I believe Donald Trump's going to be elected president, whoever is on the ballot. I have traveled this country. I've been to more than 30 states in the last 18 months, helping House Republicans get elected to build the majority. And the movement on the ground is unbelievable. And I'll tell you, I was listening to a little bit of the reporting before I came about J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance spoke to the hearts of people who I represent in the Ozarks and Appalachia, the Rust Belt, people that's always viewed as flyover country. He spoke to them, and that is a movement. So the hillbillies, the rednecks, everyone, I'm a hillbilly, all across the country, he spoke to us. I grew up in a trailer most of my life, a single wide, and we upgraded to a double wide when I was in high school. So that is a voice. We need to make sure our policies represent working class families, small businesses, and farmers.
Thank you, Congressman. It's great to have you with us here. Mr. Chairman, Jason Smith, Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio, live from Milwaukee, the site of the Republican National Convention, where we're going to have much more coverage ahead, Kailey.
Indeed, but in the meantime, we want to head to New York, where Bloomberg's David Gura is sitting down with New York Governor Kathy Hochul. David,
thanks to both of you, and welcome to our audience on radio and TV worldwide. Governor Hochul, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So a lot to talk about. Let me start first, though, with what's in the news. A torrent of headlines about President Biden's viability as a candidate. The Washington Post reporting this morning that President Obama has expressed concern about the viability of his campaign. I think of you as such a stalwart supporter of President Biden. You came out and said that, reiterated that after the debate performance. Has anything changed in these recent days as you've seen kind of the political terrain shift a bit?
What I said when I met the president, literally the day after his debate, he was here in New York City, had a rally, a lot of energy, and then a few days later, all the governors gathered in Washington to meet the president at the White House and ask him some tough questions about that performance and where he goes from there. When he said he is in it to win it, he is going the distance, he is the duly nominated candidate for president from the Democratic Party, once he said he's in, my view is he's going to be in, he's staying. As long as he's staying in this race, I am with him. He has delivered for New York in extraordinary ways that I look forward to talking about even more. And I believe in his vision for our country. So I am with him as long as he wants to do this. And he's been an extraordinary president.
So much of the reporting has centered on conversations that leaders in Congress have reportedly had with President Biden. We're fortunate two of them are New Yorkers, Leader Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries, the minority leader in the House. Have you talked to them about this? Have you registered your feelings to them in conversation?
You know, we have conversations all the time, but when people say they're having private conversations, whether it's with me or the president, then private means something. You don't divulge the content, so I won't be talking about my conversations, but they know as the leader of the state of New York, I have many priorities, but one on the political side is wearing my hat as the head of the Democratic Party to make sure that the path to Hakeem Jeffries becoming the Speaker of the House of Representatives goes right through New York State. Battleground areas like Long Island, where I just was this week, up to the Hudson Valley and over to Syracuse. So I have dedicated an enormous amount of my energy on making sure that we take back the House, because I'm a former member of the Congress. I served in the minority. And the representatives we have now who are in the majority are not giving New Yorkers what they need, and we need to change that dynamic.
So much of the concern that I hear from analysts, but politicians as well, is what this means for candidates down ballot. So let me have you talk a bit more about that. Are you hearing any word, any concern from local political offices, from candidates about how this uncertainty, this vacuum that has opened up since that debate is affecting the viability of candidates running for Congress, running for other office?
I will say this, having been elected in the most Republican district in the entire state of New York, I know that every district has unique characteristics. The issues are different. You cannot take a broad brush and say whatever happens at the top of the ticket will filter down to individuals. A lot of it's personality driven. A lot of it's accomplishment driven. So I think that you cannot possibly do that. But I think there'll be high turnout in our state. I really do. I believe that this is going to create some energy and excitement. And the people who've been loyal to the president from the beginning in districts where they carry by 20% on Long Island will still be there for Joe Biden and our congressional candidates as well. So everybody's talking about everything, but what we're not talking about enough is Donald Trump as a threat to this country. I want to shift the conversation from Democrats who are doing what they're doing, and Democrats have always been an unwieldy bunch. We used to talk about this when I worked during the Ronald Reagan, Tip O'Neill era as a congressional staffer for Senator Moynihan. Democrats are always a little more rough and tumble with our own. But we do line up and get behind our candidates, and that's what I'm expecting to see behind Joe Biden.
As the governor, you have to plan for both outcomes, either a Biden re-election victory or Donald Trump winning the election. Let me ask you about that latter scenario. If past his prologue, there were difficulties that the state had when it came to funding, when it came to policies. What worries you the most about the prospects of that happening, and how do you think through those eventualities?
No, we're always prepared, but infrastructure is critically important. You can proclaim that you're the infrastructure president, not do anything other than issue a press release, or you can actually be the infrastructure president, which is why New York City benefits from the Gateway Tunnel, for example, the largest public project done by the federal government in its history. And also private investment, upstate New York. Donald Trump did not deliver Micron to the state of New York. It was the climate that Joe Biden created in saying we need incentives to draw the semiconductor industry back from South Asia, plant it right here in the United States, and I, as governor, was able to deliver it for the state of New York with our own incentives. So that kind of partnership, that relationship that's the largest private sector investment in American history, the largest federal government investment in American history, going on simultaneously here in the state of New York. So I'm going to continue marching with Joe Biden. If it is not him, those are areas where I'm concerned. The investments in our economy, the job creation initiatives, the workforce development, but also the major infrastructure, which creates tens of thousands of good-paying jobs in our state.
You bring up infrastructure. Let me use that to segue to the latest polling. I should note your approval rating is low, 38%, the lowest it's been. But there is a bright light, I think you would say, in that polling when it comes to the decision that you made at the 11th hour to put a hold on congestion pricing in New York. 45% of voters in New York agree with that decision. A pause is inherently temporary. What is it going to take? What will make you lift that pause potentially?
The pause is in place because the world has radically changed since congestion pricing was first initiated in 2019. Inflation is a factor that's affecting New York families. Whether you live in the city, suburbs, whatever. We have to not be tone deaf to New Yorkers who are saying $15 to come into the city right now when I'm a teacher. I'm a firefighter, $3,800 more a year to work in Manhattan. It's a great place to work, but that's an extra penalty of being a New York City worker.
If it were lower, would that be more appealing to you?
There's other ways to deal with this. I will continue supporting the infrastructure projects that were contemplated to be funded by congestion pricing. And those who say I will not will soon see I know what I'm talking about. We'll be talking about this more throughout the rest of this year. Nothing can really happen until the legislature is back. But that doesn't mean that we won't have a path forward that addresses congestion, that addresses funding for MTA projects, and looks at the structure of congestion pricing. And there are other models. In London, they started, for example, at £5, not 15. It takes time. So I just can't do that to hardworking New Yorkers. They want relief. They want someone who actually listens to them. And that's exactly what I did.
Do you regret how this happened. I've talked to a lot of people who say you didn't telegraph this. This wasn't even something that a lot of people thought could be on the table, that you could put this pause in place at a very late hour when everyone going back to 2019 thought it was going to happen. Do you regret the way that it came out and the surprise that it had?
When I reflect back, I would simply say this. There has been a strong reaction by those who have the microphone. The individuals in certain media, for example, and voices that are very strong here from the legislature in the city. But what we're not hearing, what I hear that others are not listening to, are the healthcare workers who are so grateful, the hotel workers who gave me a standing ovation because they don't now have to pay almost $4,000 more a year, the police officers, firefighters. There are countless. The pizza delivery guy, the owner of Patsy's Pizza, gave me a hug and said thank you, because everything would get pushed down to the consumer and prices would have gone up. So I will say this. If there was a way to mobilize those voices and give the other perspective and have media talk about those who simply say we finally have a governor who pays attention, even at my own political cost. Yes, it was hard to do. But I also said I do not want to wake up the day after and wish I had done something to relieve New Yorkers' pain, and that is real. So that is the only issue I would say. We could have had more of the support that's I know is there. We had 9 lawsuits opposing this. So at any point, any of them could have been successful, and that would have been the death knell of congestion pricing right there. I put in a pause. I did not kill it. I put in a pause to consider the path forward at this time.
There was some speculation that you did this because there was concern about the down ballot races we were talking about before, that you were receiving some pushback or some encouragement not to do this. Any truth to that?
People can always speculate about my motivation, but they ought to know. I come from a blue-collar community. I know what it's like when you're worried about are you going to be able to send your kids to college and pick up the groceries and pay your medical bills. That's real for a lot of New Yorkers. And whether they're from Staten Island or coming in from Nassau or coming in from the Bronx, it's real. So we will continue focusing on the objectives that are behind congestion pricing, and they are meritorious, and I support them. But let's just give New Yorkers a break.
My last question is going back to the political terrain here in this state. I've been watching the Republican National Convention. Congresswoman Stefanik made the assertion that New York could go red. She's seeing the terrain change dramatically in New York State. Is that something with which you agree? And I wonder if, looking back on the race that you ran in 2022, you're not up for re-election this year, as you look sort of ahead to 2024, 2026, are there lessons to be learned from the race that you ran, which I think was a lot closer than, dare I say, you might have expected and a lot of people expected?
Right, and you look at the unique circumstances of that race.
Sure.
I became governor and had to run instantaneously. Like a year later, I was already up on the ballot. So people did not have a chance to get to know me. And there were strong campaign forces that tried to paint me with all the crimes that were happening in the state of New York. I mean, the ads were so absurd that they actually showed crimes that had been committed a decade earlier in California in ads saying Kathy Hochul's keeping you unsafe or Kathy Hochul supports criminal. It was crazy how successfully the Republicans weaponized that issue against someone who's married to a federal prosecutor. My son's a federal prosecutor, and I've always stood strongly with funding and supporting our police, and my record shows that. So that's the only takeaway from that. That was unique circumstance. They were able to paint me a certain way because New Yorkers didn't know me yet, and now they're able to see what I've accomplished. So we will not be going red, as much as everybody at that convention would love to see it. It's not happening.
Governor, great to see you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Governor Kathy Hochul, the 57th governor of the state of New York, and I'll send it back to you guys in Milwaukee. Joe and Kailey.
All right, David, we thank you. Bloomberg's David Gura in a fascinating conversation with the governor of New York, Kathy Hochul. Says New York is not going red, Kailey. And something that we could bring you exclusively here on Bloomberg as part of our conversation here in Milwaukee. Of course, joining you live from Wisconsin at the Republican National Convention, now entering day 4, but also breaking news once again on Joe Biden. The Democrats seem to be making as much news as the Republicans this week. We just got a letter released from the White House from the president's doctor, Kevin O'Connor, physician to the president here, with an update on his COVID that, of course, we just learned about yesterday. Kailey, the president's still experiencing mild upper respiratory symptoms, he writes. He continues to receive Paxlovid. He does not have a fever. Vital signs remain normal and will continue to conduct the business of the American people. The question is what he will do this weekend with more calls, including now Democratic leadership, to drop out of the race.
Yeah, notably not a call from Governor Hochul there. She said she is still behind Biden for as long as he remains in this race. But for many, in conversations that we've been having in recent days, it's not a question of if he does, but when he makes the decision not to be. As you hear growing calls publicly from the likes of Congressman Adam Schiff and also reports on private conversations that have happened with Democratic leadership, including Speaker Emerita, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, it does feel more and more like the president is being backed into a corner as he isolates in Delaware.
Yeah, we're going to be monitoring headlines closely for you here as we add the voice of Stephanie Murphy, former Congresswoman from Florida and January 6th Commission member. It's great to see you in Milwaukee, Congresswoman. I don't know how many Republican national conventions you've attended, but we've been trying to keep tabs on Democrats and their views as well. This matter of Joe Biden, though, is a serious one. I wonder if you agree with the conventional wisdom that it is not a question of if, but when. Jason Smith just sat here and said Democrats voted for him and are stuck with him.
You know, at the end of the day, there's no procedure or mechanism for anybody other than the president to make a decision to step down. And having been in Washington quite a while, and you all know this, people don't usually give up power easily. It usually has to be seized from them. And so I think you're hearing leadership in the Democratic Party trying to appeal to the patriot and to the party soldier that they know President Biden is, and show him that data that maybe his inner circle isn't showing him about the impacts of him staying on the top of the ticket for down ballot races and what that might mean for this country and for the balance of power, so to speak, in Washington come November.
So just to be clear, Congressman, you are of the belief that not only could Joe Biden lose to Donald Trump, but potentially it would mean the Democrats cannot hold on to the Senate and may be at risk of not being able to flip the House.
This race was going to be incredibly close even before that disastrous debate performance. And now he's losing his base. And so it's hard to imagine that you can put together the voters that you need in order to prevail in an election in November when your base is soft, enthusiasm is low, and you're not doing anything to win the swing voters.
Would you support Kamala Harris if this actually does transpire? Or do Democrats need to start from scratch? We're hearing that from a number of Democratic operatives who are pointing at governors from around the country. But of course, Joe Biden has a vice president.
Certainly the vice president should have consideration, but I think at this moment with high distrust of institutions and parties, the Democratic Party deserves an open debate, one that they were deprived of, which is why we are here in this moment. Primary races, no matter how short, road tests a candidate, and we do need to road test the candidate that's going to go up against Donald Trump in the fall.
Well, as we think about Donald Trump, and we just heard Governor Kathy Hochul of New York talking about this as she was trying to, put to bed the questions around Joe Biden. What she said was, we aren't talking enough about the threat that Donald Trump would pose if reelected. Are Democrats doing themselves a disservice, even if they do think they are doing it for patriotic reasons or what have you, to put so much pressure publicly on Biden to step down, making this story about Joe Biden on a week when we have heard from a litany of Republicans about Donald Trump and the policies he's likely to adopt if he does indeed win in November?
Whether Democrats say the quiet part out loud or not, the focus on the current president's mental acuity is front and center in the minds of the American people. 65% of them going into the debate felt that he didn't have the mental acuity to move forward. And that number has just increased. And now it's bleeding into others. Recent polling says that Americans are distrustful of elected officials who defend, who vouch for the current president's mental acuity and ability to carry out the next term. He's putting people in a difficult situation of risking their credibility in order to defend him. I think it's a conversation that deserves to be had in democracy.
I have to ask you about the actual convention that's underway here in Milwaukee. I thought about you when I heard from Peter Navarro yesterday, his speech hours after being released from prison. He talked about the January 6th committee, which, of course, was the source of the contempt charge that sent him to prison. I am your wake-up call. I went to prison so you don't have to. What was it like for you to watch him on stage in front of all these delegates?
So I have been here in a press capacity with coverage on this. And so it was really, they have managed to avoid talking about January 6th in the previous days of the convention, and he really was one of the first times where some of the normal MAGA kinds of party lines were really up front and center. You know, I am a constitutional Article 1 person. You know, Congress has the right to subpoena people, and if they don't respond, you know, we hold them in contempt. And it was a court and a jury of his peers that convicted him. So, and right now, the Republicans are contemplating holding Garland in contempt for not responding to Congress. And we have to protect the powers that the Constitution gave to the Congress. And if you let people defy subpoenas, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat in control, then you allow them to erode the powers of the Congress.
Be curious to see if the January 6th choir is invoked tonight or talk of pardons. These are some of the questions we have as we wait to hear from Donald Trump. A great pleasure to have Stephanie Murphy with us, Congresswoman. Thank you so much. Former Congresswoman from Florida, January 6th Commission member, the voice of a Democrat at this Republican National Convention. Thank you so much for spending time with us on the early edition of Balance of Power. I'll be back with Kailey Leinz, 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Special coverage tonight, 8 p.m. Eastern, for Donald Trump's speech on Bloomberg TV and radio. We'll see you back then on Balance of Power.